By the end of this episode, we're going to see on the homepage here, if the user is signed in, a list of books grouped by their status. What we're then going to do is write some tests for this, and then we're going to refactor these tests to make them a lot clearer. And this is a really, really nice feature of Pest that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just add a couple of other books because we've got a want to read here. Let's just add a couple more so we've got a little bit of data to play with. So we'll add one for reading, and let's say book 3 and author 3, and we'll say read. So we've got one under each category, which is going to mean we can see what we're doing. So rather than jump in with test-driven development, we're going to actually build this out first, and then we're going to write tests to it so we can focus on the Pest syntax. So we've already got our home controller. So let's grab this information and pass it through to our home controller. So we're going to say books by status, because what we want to do is group these by the status so we can show them underneath each of the headings. Now, a user might not be signed in over on the home controller at this point, so we want to be really careful to go ahead and say request user, but optionally, if that user doesn't exist, not do anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and grab the books relationship, and we're going to group them by the status on the pivot table. So we could just say pivot.status. Let's just look at this data first of all before we start to iterate through it. So I'm going to go ahead and die dump there. Let's give that a refresh. And you can see here that these are now grouped under the actual status. So you might have 3 under want to read, 2 under reading, and so on. So let's get rid of that, and let's go over to our home view and just start to iterate through these. So we want to do this down here if we are authenticated. So let's create an auth directive here. And we'll go ahead and add in a header here. So let's put that in. And let's say my books, for example. And then down here, let's create out a div. We'll add a class of space y, maybe 6, just to separate these out. And then inside of here, we're going to have a div with a heading. So let's create that heading out now just to test this out. So want to read, for example. You can add some styles to this as well. So font bold. Let's make the text slightly smaller at XL, and we'll just say slate 600. And then underneath this heading, we're going to have a list of our books. So this will be a container with a margin on the top just to separate that out. And we'll say space Y3. So we'll space out each of the books by 3. So this is going to be a book. Let's just go and duplicate that down a couple of times and have a look at what we've got. So at the moment, this doesn't look like it's spacing out properly. Let's go over to our template here and go down to where our content is. Let's wrap our slot content in a div, and let's just set the margin top to 8. There we go. So these are the books. Then we're going to have another heading based on that key that we passed down, and we're going to show all that information. So to do this, we want to iterate over this because each of the grouped by statuses is going to be different. So we'll start by creating out a for each loop, and we want to say books by status, as we want to grab the status out, but we also want to grab the books in that collection as well. So let's end that for each just there, pull this in, and this is going to be the status. Now at the moment, of course, we don't have the text value of that status, so we'll just add the status in there for now, and then we'll iterate through each of the books inside of here. So we're going to say for each books as book, and we'll end that for each there, and that will be our book component. So if we head over now, we've got want to read, reading, and read because we have one book per status. Let's just fix up the headings really quickly. We're going to be testing that we can see them, but for now, let's just go ahead and grab the full namespace to our book user pivot. Let's grab the statuses property and pass the status in there, which should grab out the text value of each of these for us. Now we just need to go through and iterate each of our books. So for this, let's create out a component just so we don't have to reuse too much markup. So let's make a component and let's call that book. Let's go ahead and replace this out with xbook, and we can add some links in here a little bit later, but let's just pass through the book into here. And let's open up book.blade.php under the components directory, and let's just output the book title just so we know this is working, and then we'll style it up So if we just come over now, we should see undefined variable book. So let's just define that as a prop just at the top here. And that should just be book. And there we go, book 1, book 2, and book 3. So that's working. All that's left to do really is just style this up, and then we've got a list of our books under the correct statuses. So let's just say background slate 100. We'll give this some padding, set this to rounded. We'll set this to flex because we're going to have some links over this side, and then the title and author and anything else that you add to that side. And for that, we'll just say justify between, and we'll say item center. Let's create out a div here with an H2. Let's change that to an H2 and have the book title there. And underneath that, we'll just have a div with the book author. And let's have a look. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Let's just style this heading up really quickly. And we'll say font bold, text large, and we'll change the color of the text to make it look a little bit nicer. And then for the author, let's go ahead and say text slate 600, so a little bit lighter, small text, and we'll set the font to normal, although we don't need to because we didn't wrap that in anything. There we go. Okay, it looks a little bit better, and we've got our link section over here if we need it. That's going to be a slot if we have it set. So let's say is set links and is end is set. And then in here, if that's the case, we will just inject that in. So that means what we can do is over on our homepage eventually, because remember these books are going to be shown to our friends eventually. We don't want an edit link, for example, if it's being shown to our friends. So we're going to say something like X slot and links, and these are going to be the links in here. So that will just put them links inside there if we need them, which in our case we do, but for our friends we do not. Okay, so we've now got a list of our books under each status. If we add another one, for example, book 4 and author 4 under want to read, we are now going to see 2 underneath there. So hopefully that makes sense. So now we're going to go ahead and test this. Now, effectively, what we're going to have to do is write 3 tests, because we're going to have a want to read book, which we want to make sure has a want to read header. We want these tests independent, so we can see that we have a want to read header and the book is underneath that want to read. So if we write 3 separate tests, that's great. Then what we're going to do is look at refactoring this down, so we only have to write technically 1 test, which Pest will run 3 times. If that doesn't make sense, it will do very shortly. Let's go ahead and start to create this test out and see what we can do. So we're going to go ahead and create out a new test here. We could put that over in the home test, but let's make a new one out, and let's call this book index test in case we decide to move it over. Make sure we provide the Pest flag and we can get started. So book index test, what do we need to do? Well, the first thing that we need is our login controller to just steal this refresh database trait. And let's put this up here because we will need to create books, and that should be it. So the first thing that we want to do, in fact, the only thing we're going to do in here is shows books with the correct status code. But we don't really want to have to write everything in here and have multiple assertions. So let's split these up into 3, and then, like I said, we'll refactor this down to 1 test that runs 3 times. So it shows books that user wants to read. Okay, so what do we need to do here? Well, the first thing that we need to do is create out a user. So let's just do this in a before each hook, because we're going to be writing 3 separate tests, so it makes a lot more sense to hook this in. So let's say this user, factory, and create. Brilliant. And now what we can do is say this user books. We can go ahead and attach a book with that status that we're testing for, which is want to read. So in here, we'll assign this at the same time as creating the book factory, and create. Now we haven't adjusted our book factory just yet, so we're going to need to do that in a minute, but let's get this in here first. The status here is going to be want to read. If we can type that, great. So let's just first head over to our book factory and update this with a title. So for this, let's just use Faker to generate out a sentence with 5 words. And for the author here, let's just use a name. That makes sense. and let's go over and we should be good. So that should create out a fake book for us. And of course, it will also attach to the user as well, which we need to make sure we pull in. Okay, so over in Pest, remember we wrote an acting as function. Let's just start to use that now because we hadn't previously. So let's say acting as user, or this user in this case. Let's go ahead and make a get request to the home page. The user should be signed in now, so they should see this book under a want to read heading. We're going to say assert C text. And again, this isn't super thorough. And we want this heading, so let's just hard code this in, want to read. And then we should assert that we see the text with the book title. We've assigned that, so we can just say book title. So we should see want to read and then title. We could actually do this with assert C in order if we wanted to. Let's just get this test working first, and then we can refactor it in a moment. So let's run pest tests feature and book index test, and let's see what we get. And great, it passes. So we now know, we already knew that it did work, but we now know that this test is confirming that that works. So if you wanted to, you could say assert C in order. That would be a little bit more thorough, and you'd want to see the text want to read, and you'd want to see the title after that. Now, it doesn't really matter too much. For UI tests, you'd probably use something like Laravel Dusk, but in our case, we're just making sure we can at least see the correct data on the page. So we've got a test that shows the books that the user wants to read. Now, our first instinct would be to go ahead and copy and paste these down and pretty much just tweak them over. So shows the books the user is reading. Let's change the status to reading. Let's change this to reading in normal case. And let's run our tests. That passes. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing again. So it shows the books the user has read. Change this to red. Change this to red. And run our test, and we get green. Now, this is a little bit repetitive. We're effectively writing the same code here, but what we're doing is we're just changing around a few things. So we're just changing around the status, and we're just changing around the text that we expect to see. Now, there's a much cleaner way to do this in one single test. Now that we've got this in here and we're testing for this, let's head over to the next episode so we can cover that feature on its own.